My name is Samuel Hayes, and I'm telling you this story because some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. 14 years have passed since my grandfather disappeared on the Chisholm Trail, but I still wake up some mornings expecting to hear his boots on the porch boards. The coffee tastes different now, weaker somehow, like everything else since he's been gone. Most folks around Abilene have forgotten about Jacob Hayes, but forgetting was never an option for me and my sister Martha. The summer of 1887 was brutal hot, the kind that makes cattle restless and men mean. Grandpa Jake had been running cattle up from Texas for near 20 years, knew every watering hole and river crossing between San Antonio and Kansas. He'd raised me and Martha after our parents died of the fever, taught us to read the sky for weather and the ground for trouble. That leather belt of his, hand-tooled with his initials J.H., was as much a part of him as his weathered hands or his morning prayers. I remember the morning he left on what would be his final drive. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. He adjusted that belt around his waist, the brass buckle catching the early light like a signal mirror. Martha had packed him biscuits and jerky, enough to last until he reached the first supply station. None of us knew we were saying goodbye forever. The herd was smaller that year, maybe 300 head, but Grandpa Jake said it would be an easy drive. He had two good hands with him, Tom Bradley and a Mexican boy named Carlos, who could sing cattle to sleep when they got spooked. The plan was simple: follow the established trail north, sell the cattle in Abilene, and be home before the first frost. Plans have a way of crumbling like old paper in a man's hands. 3 weeks passed without word, then 4. Martha started pacing the porch every evening, watching the southern horizon like she could will him back with her stare. I kept busy with the ranch work, fixing fence and tending the horses we'd kept behind, but deep down, something cold was settling in my chest, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I worked or how tired I got. When Tom Bradley stumbled into town 6 weeks later, half dead from thirst and sun sickness, we knew our worst fears had come true. He told us about the stampede near the Red River, how the cattle spooked during a thunderstorm and scattered to hell and back. In the chaos and darkness, Grandpa Jake had disappeared, and Tom never saw him again. Carlos had been trampled by the herd, died before they could get him to a doctor. Tom swore he'd searched for 3 days, calling Grandpa's name until his voice gave out. But the prairie is vast and unforgiving, and a man alone can vanish as completely as morning mist. We organized search parties, rode out for weeks, combing every gully and creek bed within 50 miles of where Tom said it happened. All we found were scattered cattle bones and the remains of old camps. Martha never got over it, the not knowing. She'd sit by the window for hours, staring south like she was waiting for a ghost to come riding home. I buried myself in work, taking over the ranch operations and trying to keep food on our table. The belt-buckle drawer in Grandpa's dresser stayed closed, too painful to open, too final to empty. Years passed like seasons, each one taking us further from that terrible summer. Martha married a shopkeeper from town and moved away, said she couldn't stand living with all the memories. I stayed on the ranch, stubborn as the old man had been, refusing to sell even when times got hard. Something deep inside told me he might still come back, that giving up the land would be like giving up on him. The ranch felt hollow without his presence, like a church with no congregation. I'd catch myself setting 3 plates at supper before remembering I was eating alone. His chair at the kitchen table gathered dust, and I couldn't bring myself to sit in it or move it away. The silence was the worst part. No more stories about the old days, no more advice given in that gruff but gentle voice. I married a good woman named Rebecca, and we had 2 sons who never got to know their great-grandfather. Sometimes I'd tell them stories about Jake Hayes, about his honesty and his strength, but words can't capture the full measure of a man. They'd listen politely, but I could see it was just history to them, distant as the Civil War or the Indian campaigns. The cattle business changed over the years, railroads replacing the long drives, progress swallowing up the old ways like floodwater. I kept a few head for tradition's sake, but mostly switched to farming wheat and corn. The Chisholm Trail grew over with grass and wildflowers, used now only by occasional travelers and the ghosts of 10,000 cattle drives. Rebecca would sometimes find me standing in Grandpa's old room, just staring at his things. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe, his shaving kit still sat on the washstand, and that empty belt drawer remained closed like a sealed tomb. She never asked me to get rid of his belongings, understood somehow that I wasn't ready to let go of the last physical traces of the man who'd shaped my life. Some nights I'd dream about him, always the same dream. He'd be sitting on the porch in his favorite chair, that leather belt around his waist, telling me about something he'd seen on the trail. I'd wake up, reaching for words I couldn't quite remember, feeling like he'd been trying to tell me something important. Dreams have their own language, and I never learned to speak it fluently. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest grief, but it never erased the questions. What happened to him out there on that dark, stormy night? Did he suffer, or was it quick? Was he calling our names when the end came, or had he made his peace with whatever fate found him? These questions followed me through the years like faithful dogs, loyal and persistent. The decade that followed Grandpa Jake's disappearance passed like a slow-moving river, each year blending into the next without much to distinguish them. I threw myself into ranching with a determination that bordered on desperation, as if hard work could somehow fill the hole his absence had left in our lives. The cattle market stabilized, wheat prices held steady, and gradually I built something resembling prosperity from the ashes of that terrible summer. Rebecca proved to be a blessing I didn't deserve, patient with my moods and understanding about the space I needed to grieve. She never pushed me to talk about Grandpa Jake, but she'd listen when the words finally came, usually late at night, when the whiskey had loosened my tongue. Our boys, William and James, grew strong and tall, working the land with the same stubborn pride their great-grandfather would have appreciated. The community around Abilene grew and changed, new families arriving as others moved on or passed away. The old-timers who remembered Jacob Hayes were fewer each year, and sometimes I felt like I was the only keeper of his memory. Tom Bradley drank himself to death 5 years after the stampede, carrying his guilt to the grave, along with whatever details he might have remembered about that night. I tried to piece together what had happened from the scattered accounts of other trail drivers who'd been in the area that summer. Lightning had split the sky like an axe, they said, and the thunder rolled for hours across the prairie. Cattle had stampeded all along the trail that night, not just our herd, and several men had been injured in the chaos. But none of them had seen hide nor hair of Jake Hayes or his distinctive leather belt. Martha would visit twice a year, usually around Christmas and on the anniversary of Grandpa's disappearance. She'd aged beyond her years, worry lines etched deep around her eyes, and we'd sit together in his old room without saying much. The grief had settled into something quieter but no less persistent, like a low-grade fever that never quite breaks. We'd stopped talking about finding him, but neither of us had stopped hoping. The ranch prospered despite my distraction, or maybe because of it. I worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, tending livestock, and expanding our wheat acreage with the single-minded focus of a man trying to outrun his thoughts. Rebecca managed the household and the books, raising our boys with the firm hand and gentle heart they needed. Life found its rhythm again, different from before, but sustainable. Our neighbors were kind but careful around the subject of my grandfather, sensing the raw nerve that still hadn't healed. When conversation turned to the old days or missing persons, they'd steer away from anything that might remind me of Jake Hayes. I appreciated their consideration, but it also made me feel like I was carrying a contagious disease that people were afraid to catch. The boys grew curious about their great-grandfather as they got older, asking questions about the man whose photograph watched over their meals from the mantelpiece. I told them stories about his honesty, his skill with horses, and his reputation for keeping his word, no matter the cost. But I couldn't tell them how the story ended, because I didn't know myself, and that uncertainty poisoned even the good memories. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking south toward Texas, scanning the horizon, as if expecting to see a familiar figure riding up the long drive. Rebecca would find me standing there and take my hand without saying anything. Her presence a reminder that I had a life in the present worth living. But the past had its hooks in me deep, and I couldn't seem to shake free no matter how hard I tried. The leather goods store in town carried belts similar to Grandpa's, hand-tooled and brass-buckled, but none with his particular craftsmanship or his initials carved deep into the leather. I'd studied his belt so closely as a boy, tracing the patterns with my finger while he told stories, that I could have recognized it blindfolded. That intimate knowledge would prove important years later, though I didn't know it then. Business took me to other towns occasionally, buying seed or selling grain, and I always found myself asking questions about missing persons and unidentified remains. County sheriffs would be polite, but not particularly hopeful, explaining that the prairie kept its secrets well and men disappeared regularly in those days. Some walked away from their troubles, others met with accidents, and a few simply vanished without explanation. The search parties had stopped after the first year, but I kept looking in my own way. Every time I rode out to check the fence lines or move cattle, I'd take a slightly different route, covering new ground and scanning for anything that didn't belong. I found old campsites, lost horseshoes, and the occasional sun-bleached bone, but nothing that connected to Jacob Hayes or that terrible night on the trail. Rebecca understood my need to keep searching, though she worried about the toll it was taking on my spirit. She'd pack extra supplies when I rode out, knowing I might be gone longer than planned if I caught sight of something promising. The boys wanted to come along on these expeditions, but I couldn't bear the thought of them finding what I was looking for, or seeing their father's reaction if we did. As the years accumulated, I began to accept that we might never know what happened to Grandpa Jake. The not knowing was its own kind of hell, but it was a hell I'd learned to live with, like a broken bone that heals crooked but still bears weight. I built a small memorial stone near the family cemetery, marking the date of his disappearance rather than his death, because hope dies harder than men do. The anniversary of that night still hit me hard every year, usually accompanied by dreams of thunderstorms and stampeding cattle. I'd wake up sweating and disoriented, reaching for something I couldn't name. Rebecca would hold me until the shaking stopped, her steady breathing a counterpoint to the chaos in my head. Love couldn't heal everything, but it made the burden bearable on the worst nights. By 1895, the cattle drives were mostly memory, replaced by railroad cars and shipping schedules that had no poetry in them. I'd adapted to the changing times, converting more pasture to cropland and investing in better farming equipment. The boys were teenagers now, William 15 and James 13, both strong enough to handle man's work and smart enough to see through their father's stubborn silences about the past. That spring brought unusual weather, late snows followed by early heat that confused the wildlife and made the cattle restless. I'd been planning to ride out to our southeastern pasture to check on a section of fence that had been damaged by winter storms. The land out there was rough country, broken by small canyons and stands of scrub oak that provided shelter for both livestock and the occasional drifter seeking to avoid main roads. William asked to come along, said he wanted to learn more about reading the land the way his great-grandfather had. I agreed, partly because he was old enough to be useful, and partly because I was tired of riding alone with my thoughts. We packed light, planning to be gone just 2 days, maybe 3 if the fence work proved more extensive than expected. Rebecca sent us off with her usual warnings about taking care and coming home safe. The ride out was pleasant, springtime showing itself in the new grass and wildflowers that dotted the prairie. William was good company, asking intelligent questions about ranch management and listening to my answers with the serious attention of someone who understood he was inheriting responsibility along with land. He had his great-grandfather's eyes, I realized, the same steady grey that missed nothing important. We made camp that first night near a small creek that fed into the Red River system, the same network of waterways that had been the scene of Grandpa Jake's last known location. I didn't mention the connection to William, but I found myself studying the landscape with renewed interest, wondering if this was the kind of country where an injured man might have sought shelter during a storm. The creek was reliable water, and the surrounding hills provided natural windbreaks. The fence repair took most of the second day, longer than expected, because the winter damage had been more extensive than I'd realized. Posts had rotted and wire had snapped, leaving gaps wide enough for cattle to wander through into rough country where they might not be found for weeks. William worked alongside me without complaint, learning to stretch wire and set posts with the patient attention his great-grandfather would have approved of. As we worked, I found myself telling him stories about Jake Hayes, stories I hadn't shared in years because the pain was still too fresh. William listened with the hungry attention of a young man learning about his roots, asking questions that showed he understood the importance of family history. I told him about the cattle drives, the dangers and the rewards, and about the pride his great-grandfather had taken in never losing a man or failing to deliver a herd. Late on the second afternoon, as we were gathering our tools and preparing to head back, William called out from the far side of a small hill where he'd been collecting fence staples. His voice carried a strange tone, excitement mixed with uncertainty, that made me drop what I was doing and hurry toward him. When I crested the hill, I found him standing beside an old fence post, weathered grey by years of wind and weather. The post was nothing unusual, probably left from some long-abandoned attempt to fence this rough country. But what caught my attention immediately was the strip of leather nailed to its side, positioned about shoulder height, as if someone had wanted it to be easily visible. Even from a distance, something about that leather looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. My heart started beating faster, responding to some recognition my conscious mind hadn't yet made. I approached the post slowly, William watching me with curious concern as my expression changed. The leather was weathered and faded, stained by years of rain and sun. But as I got closer, I could see the distinctive pattern of hand tooling that marked it as quality work. More importantly, I could make out letters carved deep into the leather, letters that spelled out initials I knew as well as my own name, J.H. My hands were shaking as I reached for the leather strip, and William asked if I was all right. I couldn't answer him immediately, my throat suddenly tight with emotions I'd kept buried for 14 years. This was Grandpa Jake's belt, or at least part of it, nailed to this remote fence post in country he might have crossed during that last fatal cattle drive. But why was it here, and who had put it here, and what did it mean? The belt had been cut, I realized as I examined it more closely. This was just a section maybe 18 inches long, containing his initials, but not the buckle or the rest of the leather. Someone had deliberately cut this piece away and nailed it to the post, positioned it carefully so it would be visible to anyone passing by. The nails were old, but not as old as the belt, suggesting this had been done sometime after Grandpa's disappearance. William was asking questions I couldn't answer, his young voice cutting through the roar of blood in my ears. Who had put it here? When? Why? Was this some kind of marker or memorial, or something else entirely? I stared at the initials carved into the leather, running my finger over letters I'd traced as a child, and felt the world shift beneath my feet, like ground breaking away in a landslide. The implications crashed over me in waves. If this was here, deliberately placed, then someone else knew what had happened to Jacob Hayes. Someone had found his body or his belongings or had been involved in his disappearance. This wasn't just a lost item blown here by the wind or dropped by accident. This was a message, though I couldn't yet understand what it was trying to tell me. I carefully worked the nails loose with my fence pliers, my hands still trembling as I freed the leather from the post. The nails were square-cut iron, the kind used for general construction, not horseshoe nails or anything that would suggest a trail camp. Someone had brought these nails here specifically to mount this piece of belt, had planned this placement carefully. The post itself was solid despite its weathered appearance, suggesting it had been here for years. As I wrapped the leather carefully in my kerchief, William asked the question that was burning in both our minds. What did this mean? I told him honestly that I didn't know, but that this was the first real evidence we'd found of what happened to his great-grandfather. After 14 years of silence, someone or something had finally provided a clue, and I intended to follow it wherever it led, no matter how long it took or how difficult the truth might be. The ride back to the ranch seemed endless, my mind churning with possibilities and implications, while William rode beside me in respectful silence. He understood without being told that we'd stumbled onto something significant, something that would change our family's relationship with the past in ways we couldn't yet predict. I kept the leather wrapped in my kerchief, checking it periodically to make sure it was still there, still real, still proof that someone knew more than they'd been telling. Rebecca took one look at my face when we arrived and knew something had happened. I showed her the leather strip, watched her features shift from curiosity to recognition to the same stunned disbelief I was still feeling. She'd only known Grandpa Jake for a few years before his disappearance, but she'd heard enough stories and seen enough photographs to recognize his handiwork when she saw it. This was definitely his belt, no question about it. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Rebecca and I sat at the kitchen table studying the leather by lamplight. The hand tooling was distinctive, featuring a pattern of interwoven vines and leaves that Jake had developed over years of practice. The initials were carved deep and clean, filled with years of accumulated dirt and oil that made them stand out against the faded brown leather. This wasn't just any belt. This was specifically his belt, and someone had wanted us to know it. I tried to remember everything Tom Bradley had told us about that night, searching for details that might explain how this piece of belt had ended up nailed to a remote fence post. The stampede had scattered cattle across miles of prairie, but Tom had said he'd searched the immediate area thoroughly. Either he'd missed something important, or someone else had found evidence and chosen not to report it to the authorities or to our family. Sleep came hard that night, my mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. Who had found this belt, and when? Why had they cut off just this section instead of bringing the whole thing back? Why nail it to a fence post in the middle of nowhere instead of returning it to family or turning it over to the sheriff? The placement seemed deliberate, like someone had wanted it to be found, but only by someone who knew the country well enough to ride those remote sections. The next morning brought a steady rain that matched my mood, grey and persistent. I spent the day trying to focus on normal ranch work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that weathered piece of leather and what it might represent. Rebecca suggested we ride back out to the fence post together, said maybe 2 sets of eyes might spot something I'd missed in my initial shock at the discovery. It was a good idea, but the weather would have to clear first. William was full of questions at breakfast, wanting to know what we planned to do next and whether we'd be searching for more evidence. I told him honestly that I didn't have a plan yet, that I needed time to think through the implications before deciding on a course of action. James listened with the wide-eyed attention of a boy being introduced to family history, more dramatic than any dime novel. Both boys understood they were witnessing something important. I wrote a letter to Martha that afternoon, telling her about the discovery and asking if she wanted to come out for a visit. She deserved to know what we'd found, deserved to see this proof that someone, somewhere, knew more about Grandpa Jake's fate than they'd been willing to share. The not knowing had been hard on all of us, but Martha had carried it differently, internalizing the uncertainty until it had become part of her fundamental nature. The rain continued for 3 days, giving me too much time to think and not enough outlets for the nervous energy that was building inside me. I found myself pacing the house like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the leather strip as if it might have changed or disappeared. Rebecca finally suggested I ride into town, talk to Sheriff Patterson about what we'd found, get his opinion on what it might mean and what we should do next. Sheriff Patterson was a practical man who'd served in the position for 8 years, dealing mostly with the routine problems of a growing agricultural community. He listened to my story with professional attention, examined the leather carefully, and agreed that it was almost certainly genuine. But he was honest about the limitations of what law enforcement could do 14 years after the fact, particularly when the evidence consisted of a single piece of leather found in remote country. He did make some useful suggestions, though. The fence post itself might provide clues about when it was placed and by whom. The nails could be traced to their source if they were unusual enough. Most importantly, someone in the area might remember seeing strangers or unusual activity near that section of country. It would require methodical investigation, but there were leads worth following if I was determined to pursue them. I asked Sheriff Patterson about the possibility that someone had been deliberately concealing information about Grandpa Jake's disappearance. He said it was possible, but pointed out that people had their own reasons for staying quiet about things they'd seen or heard. Maybe someone had found evidence but been afraid of getting involved with the law. Maybe they'd had their own troubles and couldn't afford the attention that comes with being a witness to tragedy. The sheriff offered to ride out to the fence post with me once the weather cleared, said he'd like to see the location for himself and maybe ask some questions of folks who lived in that area. It was more help than I'd expected, and I appreciated his willingness to take the matter seriously, despite the passage of time. Most lawmen would have written it off as ancient history, but Patterson understood that some wounds don't heal until the truth comes to light. Martha arrived on the evening train, looking older and more fragile than I remembered, but with a determined set to her jaw that reminded me of Grandpa Jake. She examined the leather strip with the same careful attention I'd given it, tracing the familiar initials with fingers that remembered adjusting that belt around an old man's waist on countless mornings. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of recognition rather than fresh grief. We sat up late that night, Martha and Rebecca and I, talking about possibilities and making plans for the investigation ahead. Martha was determined to be involved despite her husband's concerns about the emotional toll this might take on her. She'd lived with the uncertainty for 14 years, she said, and she deserved to be part of finding whatever truth was still available to us. I agreed, understanding that she needed this closure as much as I did. The leather strip lay on the table between us, a tangible link to a man we'd all loved and lost. It wasn't much to build hope on, just a few inches of weathered cowhide and some carefully carved initials. But it was more than we'd had yesterday, more than we'd had for 14 years. It was proof that Jacob Hayes had existed, had mattered to someone enough that they'd preserve this piece of him, even if they couldn't or wouldn't return it to his family. As the evening wore on, I found myself studying that piece of leather with new eyes, looking for details I might have missed in my initial shock. The cut edges were clean, made with a sharp knife rather than torn by accident or weather. The positioning of the initials suggested this section had been chosen deliberately, selected for maximum recognition value. Someone had wanted this to be identified, had wanted us to know whose belt this had been. The rain finally broke on a Thursday morning, leaving the air clean and the sky that particular shade of blue that only comes after a good storm. Sheriff Patterson arrived just after breakfast, ready to ride out to the fence post and begin what he called a proper investigation, though he warned us not to expect too much after so many years. Martha insisted on coming along despite her lack of recent riding experience, and I was glad for her company. The ride out to the southeastern pasture took most of the morning, the ground soft from rain, but not muddy enough to slow our progress significantly. Sheriff Patterson proved to be good traveling company, asking intelligent questions about the area and the timeline of events surrounding Grandpa Jake's disappearance. He was building a mental map of the investigation, trying to understand how all the pieces might fit together. When we reached the fence post, Patterson dismounted and spent considerable time examining both the post itself and the ground around it. He was looking for evidence of when the leather might have been placed there, any signs of recent disturbance, or clues about who might have been responsible. The post was old but solid, he noted, probably placed when someone had attempted to fence this section years ago but abandoned the project. The nails interested him particularly. They were square-cut iron, he confirmed, probably manufactured sometime in the 1880s or early 1890s. Not unusual nails, but not the kind most ranchers would carry for routine fence work either. Someone had brought these nails here specifically for the purpose of mounting that piece of leather, which suggested premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment decision to create some kind of memorial. Martha walked the area around the post, looking for anything we might have missed during our initial discovery. She had her own memories of Grandpa Jake's belongings, different details that might prove significant if we found more evidence. The terrain was rough but not impossible to traverse, she noted, the kind of country where an injured man might have sought shelter if he'd been separated from his companions during a storm. Patterson interviewed me thoroughly about Tom Bradley's account of that night, looking for inconsistencies or details that might suggest the hired hand had been concealing information. I told him honestly that Tom had seemed genuinely distraught about losing track of Grandpa Jake, and that his guilt had eventually contributed to his death from alcohol. But people could carry secrets even when they seemed transparent, and Tom had been the only witness to the events of that night. We spent the rest of the afternoon expanding our search in widening circles around the fence post, looking for any other evidence that might have been left behind. Patterson was systematic about it, marking areas we'd covered and making notes about the terrain and potential hiding places. If someone had concealed other items in this area, he wanted to give us the best chance of finding them before we gave up and went home. As the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, Martha called out from a small grove of scrub oak about 100 yards from the fence post. She'd found what looked like the remains of an old campsite, barely visible after years of weather and neglect. Patterson and I hurried over to examine what she'd discovered, hoping it might provide additional clues about who had been in this area and when. The campsite was minimal, just a circle of stones that had once contained a fire and a cleared area where someone might have spread bedrolls, but it was positioned to be almost invisible from the main trails, suggesting someone had wanted privacy for their stay in this area. Patterson found a few rusted cans and what might have been the remains of a coffee pot, evidence that the camp had been used for more than just one night. More interesting was a small pile of stones near the edge of the clearing, arranged in a pattern that didn't look natural. Patterson and I carefully dismantled the pile, wondering if someone had used it to mark the location of buried items. About a foot down, we hit something that wasn't dirt or rock, something that made a different sound when the shovel struck it. My heart started racing as we dug more carefully around the object. It was a metal box, probably a tobacco tin, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Patterson opened it carefully while Martha and I watched with held breath. Inside were several items that made my knees go weak, a tarnished silver watch that I recognized as belonging to Grandpa Jake, a small leather journal with water stains but still readable text, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it might be a letter or note. The watch was definitely his, engraved with his initials on the back and showing the same small dent near the winding stem that I remembered from childhood. The journal was his too, filled with notes about cattle, weather and trail conditions in his distinctive handwriting, but it was the folded paper that held our attention most intensely because it appeared to be a message written by someone else, someone who had known what happened to Jacob Hayes. Patterson unfolded the paper carefully, revealing several lines of text written in pencil that had faded but was still legible. It was addressed to the family of Jacob Hayes and dated 3 months after his disappearance. The message was brief but earth-shaking. Found him after the storm, tried to save him but was too late, couldn't bring the body back alone, so I buried him proper and marked the spot. Look for 3 stones by the old cottonwood near Devil's Creek. I'm sorry for your loss. A friend. The note wasn't signed, but it was clearly written by someone literate and caring, someone who had taken the time to ensure Grandpa Jake received a decent burial even though they couldn't return his body to family. The reference to Devil's Creek was important because it was a known landmark about 10 miles northeast of where we were standing. If the directions were accurate, we might finally be able to locate his grave and bring him home. Martha was crying quietly as she held the watch, her tears a mixture of grief and relief after so many years of uncertainty. We finally had answers, or at least the beginning of answers, about what had happened to the man who had raised us and shaped our understanding of honor and responsibility. Someone had cared enough to bury him properly and leave directions for his family, even if they hadn't been able to deliver the message in person. Sheriff Patterson was already making plans for the next phase of our investigation. We'd need to locate Devil's Creek and search for the burial site described in the note. We'd need to determine if the remains could still be found and recovered after so many years. Most importantly, we'd need to try to identify the person who had written the note and learn more about the circumstances of Grandpa Jake's death. As we prepared to ride back to the ranch, I took one last look around the area where we'd made these discoveries. Someone had created an elaborate memorial here, preserving important items and leaving clues that would eventually lead us to the truth. It had taken 14 years for us to find these messages, but they'd been waiting patiently for family to come looking, preserved by someone who understood the importance of bringing loved ones home. We rode out to Devil's Creek 3 days later. A larger party this time that included Sheriff Patterson, myself, Martha, and 2 of Patterson's deputies who could help with the difficult work of locating and potentially recovering remains. Rebecca had wanted to come, but someone needed to stay with the boys and manage the ranch. She packed us supplies for several days, understanding this might be a longer search than our previous investigations. Devil's Creek ran clear and cold even in late spring, fed by springs that kept it flowing year-round. The area was remote enough that few people had reason to visit regularly, which might explain why the burial site had remained undisturbed for so many years. Patterson had brought surveying equipment to help us map the area systematically, ensuring we didn't miss anything important in our search for the 3 stones by the old cottonwood. The cottonwood wasn't hard to find. It was an ancient tree, probably 100 years old or more, standing alone near a bend in the creek where the soil would have been soft enough for digging. Its massive trunk and distinctive bark made it an unmistakable landmark, exactly the kind of reference point someone would choose when trying to leave directions for others to follow. The tree had survived because it was too big to cut down easily and too valuable as a marker to destroy. Finding the 3 stones took longer. Years of weather and seasonal floods had shifted things around, and what might have been obvious markers in 1887 were now partially buried or moved from their original positions. But Patterson's methodical approach eventually paid off when one of his deputies found 3 large rocks arranged in a rough triangle about 50 yards from the cottonwood. positioned to catch the morning sun. The area between the stones had settled slightly over the years, creating a shallow depression that suggested something had been buried there and gradually compressed the soil. Patterson had brought proper excavation tools, understanding that if we found remains, they would need to be handled with respect and care. Martha stood nearby, her hand on the cottonwood's bark, while we began the careful process of digging. About 3 feet down, we encountered something that wasn't natural soil. It was wood, weathered but still intact, suggesting someone had taken the time to construct a proper coffin rather than simply wrapping the body in canvas or cloth. The wood was rough-cut pine, probably from lumber the person had carried with them or salvaged from abandoned structures. It showed the kind of careful craftsmanship that came from someone who took their responsibilities seriously. Inside the makeshift coffin, we found the remains of Jacob Hayes. After 14 years in the ground, there wasn't much left beyond bones and a few metal objects, but there was enough to confirm his identity. The silver belt buckle was there, tarnished but unmistakable, along with the brass buttons from his favorite shirt and the small penknife he'd always carried. A few scraps of leather remained from his boots, and his wedding ring was still on his finger. Martha knelt beside the grave and said a prayer for the man who had raised us both, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Patterson removed his hat respectfully, and even his deputies stood silent as she spoke about Grandpa Jake's life and the love he'd shown his family. It was a moment of closure we'd been waiting 14 years to have, bitter and sweet at the same time. The condition of the remains told us something about how he'd died. There were no obvious signs of violence, no broken bones or damage that would suggest he'd been murdered or attacked. Instead, it looked like he'd died from natural causes, possibly exhaustion or exposure, after being separated from his companions during the storm. The person who buried him had positioned his body carefully, hands folded across his chest in the traditional manner of the recently deceased. More importantly, we found additional evidence of the care taken by whoever had discovered and buried him. The coffin had been lined with what remained of a good wool blanket, and small personal items had been arranged around the body with obvious respect. Someone had spent considerable time and effort ensuring Jacob Hayes received a burial worthy of the man he'd been, even though they were complete strangers who owed him nothing. As we prepared to move his remains for reburial in the family cemetery, I found myself wondering about the person who had written that note and gone to such lengths to preserve Grandpa Jake's dignity in death. They'd known his name somehow, known he had family who would want him returned home. They'd created an elaborate system of markers and messages designed to lead us to this moment, but they'd never revealed their own identity or sought recognition for their kindness. Sheriff Patterson made careful notes about everything we found, documenting the burial site and the condition of the remains for his official report. He said he'd continue investigating the identity of the person who had written the note, though he cautioned that after so many years the trail might be too cold to follow. What mattered most was that we'd found Jacob Hayes and could bring him home where he belonged. The ride back to the ranch was solemn but peaceful, our wagon carrying the wooden box that now held Grandpa Jake's remains and the few personal items we'd recovered from the grave. Martha rode beside me, holding the silver watch and occasionally opening it to listen to its familiar tick. The watch had stopped years ago, but somehow it felt important to keep it close, a tangible connection to the man we'd just found. Rebecca was waiting on the porch when we arrived, and she came down to help Martha from her horse with the gentle attention of someone who understood what the day had cost us emotionally. The boys appeared from the barn where they'd been working, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and respect that comes with witnessing family history unfold. They'd grown up hearing stories about their great-grandfather, and now they'd be part of the story of bringing him home. That evening we held a simple ceremony in the parlor, with Grandpa Jake's coffin resting on the table where he'd eaten so many meals and told so many stories. Friends and neighbors came to pay their respects, many of them people who had known and worked with Jacob Hayes during his lifetime. It was the funeral we'd never been able to hold, the formal goodbye that had been denied to us by the circumstances of his disappearance. Martha stayed for another week, helping to arrange for a proper headstone and spending time in the family cemetery where Grandpa Jake would finally rest beside his wife and other relatives. She seemed lighter somehow, as if the uncertainty she'd carried for so many years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The not knowing had been harder to bear than the grief, she told me, because grief at least had boundaries while uncertainty stretched on forever. The boys asked thoughtful questions about their great-grandfather and about the person who had taken such care with his burial. I told them honestly that we might never know who had been responsible for preserving his dignity and guiding us to his resting place, but that such kindness deserved to be remembered and honored even if we couldn't thank the person directly. Some good deeds were their own reward, requiring no recognition beyond the knowledge that the right thing had been done. Sheriff Patterson continued his investigation for several more weeks, interviewing older residents of the area and checking records for anyone who might have been traveling through that country during the relevant time period. He found a few possibilities: men who had been known for their honesty and their willingness to help strangers, but nothing definitive enough to identify our mysterious benefactor. The person had covered their tracks well, or perhaps had simply moved on to other parts of the country. In the end, the identity of the person who buried Grandpa Jake and left us the clues to find him became less important than the act itself. Someone had seen a need and filled it, had recognized that every person deserves dignity in death, regardless of the circumstances that brought them to their final moment. They'd taken time from their own life and journey to ensure a stranger received proper burial and that his family eventually learned his fate. The funeral took place on a Sunday morning in late spring, with the pastor from town conducting a service that celebrated Jacob Hayes' life rather than dwelling on the mysteries surrounding his death. We buried him next to his wife Sarah, in the plot he'd selected years earlier when he'd been planning for a future none of us could have imagined. The headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved grandfather and faithful friend." As the last shovel of dirt was placed over his grave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 14 years. Peace. The questions that had haunted our family were finally answered, and the man who had shaped our understanding of honor and responsibility was finally home. The mystery was solved, the circle closed, and Jacob Hayes could rest in the knowledge that his family had never stopped looking for him and never stopped loving him. In the weeks following Grandpa Jake's funeral, life settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. The questions that had dominated our family's conversations for 14 years were finally answered, leaving space for other thoughts and concerns to surface. Martha returned to her home in town with a lighter step and clearer eyes, finally able to grieve properly now that she knew the full story of our grandfather's fate. The boys threw themselves into summer work with renewed energy, as if understanding their family's complete history had given them a stronger foundation to build upon. William proved especially interested in the stories I could now tell without the shadow of uncertainty hanging over them. He wanted to know everything about Jacob Hayes, from his childhood in Missouri to his final years on the Kansas prairie. And I found myself remembering details I'd thought were lost forever. Rebecca noticed the change in me most clearly. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders for over a decade had finally released, and I slept better than I had since the summer of 1887. She said I smiled more easily now, laughed at the boys' jokes without the distracted air that had characterized my reactions for so many years. Finding Grandpa Jake and bringing him home had healed something in me that I hadn't even realized was wounded. Sheriff Patterson made his final report on the investigation, concluding that Jacob Hayes had died of natural causes, most likely exposure and exhaustion after becoming separated from his companions during the storm. The person who found and buried him remained unidentified, but Patterson noted that their actions demonstrated unusual care and respect for the deceased. It was a mystery within a mystery, but one that brought honor rather than shame to everyone involved. I found myself thinking often about that unknown person who had taken such care with Grandpa Jake's remains and gone to such elaborate lengths to ensure his family could find him. They'd invested considerable time and effort in creating the trail of clues that led us to Devil's Creek, yet they'd sought no recognition or reward for their kindness. It was the kind of anonymous generosity that restored faith in human nature, proof that decency existed even in the hardest circumstances. The leather belt fragment now rested in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, alongside the recovered silver watch and a photograph of Jacob Hayes taken shortly before his final cattle drive. These objects had become family treasures, tangible links to a man whose influence continued to shape our daily decisions and long-term plans. The boys would handle them carefully when cleaning, understanding they were touching history as well as leather and metal. Business continued as usual on the ranch, but with a new sense of purpose that came from understanding our complete family story. I made decisions about land use and livestock management with confidence, knowing I was building on a foundation laid by a man who had faced his own challenges with courage and integrity. The uncertainty that had clouded our family's legacy was gone, replaced by pride in Jacob Hayes's character and gratitude for his influence on our lives. Martha visited more frequently now, no longer avoiding the ranch because it reminded her of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. She'd bring her husband and children for Sunday dinners, and we'd sit on the porch afterward, sharing stories and watching the sun set over land that had been in our family for decades. The conversations were easier now, flowing naturally without the awkward pauses that had characterized our previous attempts to discuss family history. I began keeping a journal myself, partly inspired by finding Grandpa Jake's trail notes and partly because I realized how much family history could be lost if no one took the trouble to write it down. I recorded not just the facts of our daily lives, but also the stories and lessons that had been passed down through generations. Future family members would know where they came from and what principles had guided their ancestors through difficult times. The mystery of our anonymous benefactor continued to intrigue me, though I'd accepted that we might never learn their identity. I asked questions of older residents whenever I traveled to neighboring towns, describing the time frame and the careful nature of the burial we'd discovered. A few people remembered hearing about a stranger who'd helped with various problems during that general period, someone described as quiet but reliable, willing to lend a hand when needed, but never staying long in one place. One old-timer in Ellsworth thought he remembered a man matching that description, someone who'd worked briefly at different ranches during the late 1880s and early 1890s. The man had been skilled with horses and cattle, the old-timer said, and had shown unusual respect for deceased animals and people alike. He'd been seen giving proper burial to livestock that died from disease or accident, taking time to dig adequate graves, even when he wasn't being paid for the extra work. The description suggested someone with strong moral principles, possibly influenced by religious beliefs or military training that emphasized respect for the dead. Such a person would naturally take care with Jacob Hayes's burial, ensuring it met proper standards regardless of the inconvenience involved. They might also have the organizational skills necessary to create the elaborate trail of clues that had led us to the burial site years later. I shared these speculations with Sheriff Patterson, who agreed they were plausible but cautioned against building too much hope of identification on such slim evidence. The country had been full of transient workers during that period, men moving from job to job as opportunities presented themselves. Many of them had been decent people who would have acted similarly if faced with the situation our benefactor had encountered, but tracking them down after so many years was nearly impossible. As summer progressed toward fall, I found myself accepting that some mysteries might remain unsolved, while still being grateful for the resolution we'd achieved. The important questions had been answered. Jacob Hayes had died of natural causes. He'd received proper burial from someone who cared about human dignity, and he was now resting where he belonged among family who had never stopped loving him. The identity of the person responsible for making this possible was less crucial than the act itself. The anniversary of Grandpa Jake's disappearance came and went, without the usual emotional turmoil that had marked previous years. Instead of wondering what had happened to him, we were able to remember his life and celebrate his influence on our family. Martha and her family joined us for a memorial service at his grave, where we shared stories and expressed gratitude for the lessons he'd taught us about integrity, perseverance, and love. 5 years have passed since we brought Grandpa Jake home, and the story of his disappearance and recovery has become part of our family's permanent history. The boys are young men now, William 20 and James 18, both carrying themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from understanding where they come from and what values they're expected to uphold. They work the ranch with skill and dedication, building on traditions established by their great-grandfather decades ago. Martha's health improved dramatically after we solved the mystery, as if the uncertainty had been literally weighing on her physical well-being. She became more active in her community, organizing charitable activities and helping other families dealing with missing relatives. Her own experience with prolonged uncertainty made her particularly effective at providing comfort and practical assistance to people facing similar situations. She understood how hope and despair could coexist for years without resolution. The ranch prospered under my management, benefiting from the peace of mind that came with having our family's story complete. I made long-term investments in land and equipment with confidence, knowing I was building something solid for future generations. The success wasn't just financial, it was spiritual and emotional, rooted in the understanding that we were continuing work begun by a man of integrity who had faced his own challenges with courage and grace. Rebecca and I had another child, a daughter we named Sarah after Grandpa Jake's wife. She grew up hearing stories about her great-grandfather as natural parts of family conversation rather than painful subjects to be avoided or approached carefully. The leather belt fragment and silver watch were familiar objects to her, treasures to be handled respectfully but not fearfully. She absorbed the family history without carrying the burden of unanswered questions that had shadowed previous generations. I continued my informal investigation into the identity of the person who had buried Grandpa Jake, not because I expected to find answers, but because the search itself had become a way of honoring their kindness. Over the years, I collected stories about anonymous good deeds, acts of generosity performed by people who sought no recognition or reward. The pattern suggested there were more such individuals than most people realized. Quiet heroes whose influence rippled outward in ways they probably never understood. One story particularly caught my attention, told by an elderly woman in Dodge City who remembered a man who had helped her family during a difficult winter in the early 1890s. He'd appeared at their homestead during a blizzard, worked for 3 days, helping them care for sick livestock and repair storm damage, then disappeared before they could properly thank him. The woman described him as middle-aged, soft-spoken, and careful in his work, someone who seemed to derive satisfaction from solving problems rather than from being praised for his efforts. The description matched others I'd collected over the years, suggesting our benefactor might have been one of those rare individuals who made helping others his life's work. Such people existed in every generation, moving quietly through communities and addressing needs they encountered without fanfare or expectation of reward. They were motivated by principles rather than profit, driven by an internal compass that pointed consistently towards service and kindness. Sheriff Patterson retired but continued to take interest in the case, occasionally sharing information about similar situations he'd encountered during his career. He'd seen other examples of anonymous kindness, he told me. Situations where strangers had gone to extraordinary lengths to help people they'd never met and would never see again. The common thread was always the same: decent people doing what they believed was right, regardless of personal cost or inconvenience. The boys grew curious about this aspect of their family's story as they matured, asking thoughtful questions about the motivation behind such selfless behavior. I tried to explain that some people were simply built differently, that their sense of responsibility extended beyond their own families and communities to encompass anyone in need. Jacob Hayes had been such a person, I told them, which might explain why he'd attracted the attention of someone similar during his final days. William decided to study law, inspired partly by Sheriff Patterson's work on our case and partly by his own desire to help families find resolution when loved ones went missing. He understood from personal experience how devastating uncertainty could be, and how much difference it made when someone cared enough to keep investigating even when the trail seemed cold. James chose to stay on the ranch, but he also volunteered with local search parties when people went missing in our area. As I grew older and my own sons took increasing responsibility for ranch operations, I found myself spending more time in contemplation of the lessons learned from our family's experience. The most important revelation wasn't about Jacob Hayes' fate, significant as that had been, but about the existence of people who made kindness their life's work without seeking recognition or reward. Such individuals were proof that decency wasn't just a pleasant ideal, but a practical force that could change lives and heal wounds. The mystery of our benefactor's identity remained unsolved, and I'd come to believe it might be meant to stay that way. Perhaps the anonymity was part of the gift, a reminder that good deeds didn't require signatures or acknowledgement to be meaningful. The person who had cared for Grandpa Jake and guided us to his resting place had given us more than closure. They'd provided an example of how to live with integrity and compassion regardless of circumstances. On quiet evenings when the ranch work was done and the family gathered on the porch, I sometimes told the story of how we'd found the leather belt nailed to that remote fence post. The younger grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, fascinated by the mystery and the eventual resolution. But I always emphasized the most important part. Somewhere out there had been a person who cared enough about a stranger to ensure he received dignity in death and that his family eventually learned the truth. That lesson seemed more valuable than any treasure we might have found, more lasting than any material inheritance we could leave to future generations. Jacob Hayes had been a good man who'd raised his family with love and integrity, but his influence had been magnified by the kindness of someone who'd never expected recognition or reward. It was a reminder that our actions mattered beyond our own immediate circles, that decency could echo across years and generations in ways we might never fully understand. The leather belt fragment still sits on our mantelpiece, weathered and faded but carefully preserved. Visitors sometimes ask about it, and I tell them the story of how it led us to the truth about a man who'd been missing for 14 years. But I always end with the real point of the story, that somewhere in this hard world, people exist who make kindness their daily practice, who see need and respond to it without calculation or expectation. They may remain anonymous, but their influence lives on in the lives they touch and the example they set. That's the legacy I want to leave my children and grandchildren, not just the story of Jacob Hayes and his mysterious benefactor, but the understanding that each of us has the opportunity to be that kind of person for someone else. We can choose to act with compassion when we encounter need, to preserve dignity when we witness loss, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. It's a simple philosophy, but it's one that can change everything for the people whose lives we touch, just as one stranger's kindness changed everything for our family on a dark night long ago.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.